a beautiful morning, and of course, it's the last day in the month of August 2021. I'm super excited this morning, and I guess you are also. Every day I say, welcome to today's newspaper review this morning. And like we do it, we have various newspapers this morning. I have with me the Punch newspaper, Daily Sun newspaper, the Nation newspaper, the Guardian newspaper, and lastly is the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. And like we do, I start with the Punch newspaper this morning. And the front page stories of the Punch newspaper this morning is I have the major news headline, strike. And that's coming from the ASU strike. It says ASU accuses federal government of deficits as minister explains payment delay. ASU accuses federal government of deficit as minister explains payment delay. Says government dishonest. Transferring money from CBN shouldn't be difficult, and that is coming from varsity lecturers. We will make our decision known. Today's ultimatum stands. That is coming from the Academic Staff Union of University. And then government pursuing CBN to disburse revitalization fund, says Education Minister. All the stories can be found on page 2 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. And moving above the major news headline, says airline suffers 28.5% drop in domestic aircraft movements. The story also can be found on page 21 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. Conflicting judgments, NBA to meet CJN, Mohammed summons six chief judges. This story can be found inside page 2 also. And then on page 22, federal government presents budget October, target 3 billion from Euro bonds. You can read the story inside page 22 of the Punch newspaper this morning. And I'm moving to page 18, 21-day notice. NMA blames federal government for suits. You can turn into page 18 this morning to read more on that story. And I'm moving below the major news headline, and that's on page 5. Lagos, NAFDAC short toxic chemical plant arrest 4. You can get the Punch newspaper this morning and turn it to page 5 to read more on that story. And then DSS boss to pressure releases 8 Igboho boss. DSS boss to pressure and then releases 8 Igboho's 8. You can turn it to page 9 this morning to read more on that story. And I'm moving ahead, that's on page 12. Autumn films at Akume calls from emergency rule in Benue. Autumn films as Akume calls for emergency rule in Benue State. You can turn it to page 12 this morning to read more on that story. And then moving ahead, and that's on page 20. Taking about formulation after 14 days of preparation risky. And that is coming from NAFDAC warning Nigerians that we should desist from taking herbal formulation after 14 days of preparation. And then moving ahead, that's on page 5. NDA invasion, more troubles coming, Father Mbaka warns. You can turn it to the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving ahead, and that's on page 4 and 5. Lagos transport workers dies during fights over 500 naira bets. Lagos transport worker dies during fights over 500 naira belts. You can get a copy of the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on that story, and that's on page 4 and 5. And then moving ahead, and that last news content on page 12 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. Amechi's confession confirmed deep corruption in Buhari's regime. Amechi's confession confirmed deep corruption in Buhari's regime, and that is coming from the opposition party PDP this morning. You can get a copy of the Punch newspaper this morning to read more on the stories. And then moving ahead, we move to the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. On the front page stories of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning, confusion over alleged Plateau Assembly ceiling. Confusion over alleged Plateau Assembly ceiling. Military warns residents against self-defense. You can turn it to page 4 and 6 this morning to read more on that story. And then moving above the major news headline, Nigerians groan as cooking gas price hits 7,000 per 12.5 kg. Nigerians groan as cooking gas price hits 7,000 naira per 12.5 kg. VAT on LPG imports begins. You can turn it to page 25 this morning to read more on that story. And on 2021 admission, JAMB institutions decide fate of 1.4 million candidates today. You can turn into page 3 this morning of the Daily Sun newspaper to read more on that story. And I'm still on the front page stories of our daily newspaper in Nigeria, and that's on the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. CJN summons 6 state CJs over conflicting court orders. Rivers, Anambra, Imo, Kebbi, Cross River, Jigawa State, while we shot at cargo boats on Bani River, DHQ. That's on page 6. You can turn it to page 6 this morning to read more on that story. And then with that, I move to the Nation newspaper this morning. On the front page stories of the Nation newspaper this morning, on the major news headline, I have Mark Panel links PDP crisis to Wike and Secondos. Mark Panel links PDP crisis to Wike and Secondos. Reconciliation team seeks withdrawal of cases. NBA conflicting rulings ridiculous. CJN invites Rivers, Cross River State, Kebbi, Jigawa, Anambra, Imo chief judge over contradictory orders. You can read this story on the front page of the Nation newspaper this morning. And I'm moving ahead, that's above the major news headline this morning. 4th week of Southeast, Ghost Monday turns bloody. You can turn into page 5 this morning to read more on that story. And I'm moving ahead, that's on page 4. Retrieve arms from repentant terrorists. Retrieve the arms from the repentant terrorists, and that is on page 6. You can turn into page 6 this morning of the Nation newspaper to read more on that story. And the senator, my slain son's life not better than any Nigeria. My slain son's life not better than any Nigeria. And that is coming from the senator whose son was slain by bandits yesterday. And then moving ahead, that's on page 9. Ihe Nacho in the D, others it's Eagles Lagos camp. Ihe Nacho in the D, others it's Lagos Eagles camp today. And then moving below the major news headline, it says Ondo makes COVID-19 vaccination compulsory, no jab, no access to hospital, churches, and mosques. So this morning, everyone in Ondo State has been mandated to get their COVID-19 vaccine jab. That is, without the COVID-19 jab being received, no entrance to the hospital, no entrance to churches, and no entrance to mosques. Also, and that is coming from the Ondo State Governor and the person of Mr. Rotimi Akeredolu. And then moving ahead, that's on page 6. Finance Minister, Economy on Recovery Path growing. Federal government to finance 2022 budget deficit with 1 billion euro. And that's on page 6. And then court rejects Malami's application to vacate order on Igboho. That's on page 3. You can get a copy of the Nation newspaper this morning to read more on all the stories this morning. Moving ahead, I have the Guardian newspaper. On the front page stories of the Guardian newspaper this morning, I have the major news headline with COVID-19 vaccination. CSOs tackle Edo state government on restrictions and profiling. Ondo declares no vaccination, no access to religion centers and others. 3 die as Edo inoculates 19,579 persons. Coalition cautious of Baseki over compulsory vaccination, and the Nigeria records 93 deaths, 362 new cases of COVID-19, and that is coming from the Nigeria Center for Disease Control. You can read this story on the front page of the Guardian newspaper this morning, and then continue from page 2 inside the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then moving below the major news headline, it says federal government targets over 365 billion naira yearly with reintroduction of toll gates. Federal government targets over 365 billion naira yearly with the reintroduction of toll gates. Moving below it, also you can read that on the front page of the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then moving below it is the World Health Organization backs local therapies for COVID-19. World Health Organization backs local therapies for COVID-19. You can turn into the Guardian newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then budget exposes 4.5 billion naira suspicious payments by NDAs. You can turn into page 7 this morning to read more on that story. And then moving ahead, security operative Lesage to Plateau Assembly. You can find more on that story by getting a copy of the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then lastly, which is on page 4, CJN summons 6 chief judges over conflicting orders. You can get a copy of the Guardian newspaper this morning to read more on that stories. And then lastly, on the newspaper review this morning on the Gallery TV, I have the Daily Independent newspaper this morning, and the major news headline says structural imbalances overshadow 2021 GDP growth. Says 5.01% GDP to be felt on industries, unemployment drops, and that is coming from the federal government of Nigeria. Says we are borrowing sensibly, investing in infrastructure, others. NBS forecasts 5% GDP growth by year end. All this agriculture funding. You can turn it to page 4 this morning to read more on that story on the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. And still on the front page stories of the Nigeria dailies, and that's on above the major news headline of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. It says insurance regulators go after guys delaying claims payments. And then party crisis, CJN summons chief judge over conflicting orders. You can turn it to the Daily Independent this morning to read more on that stories. And then moving below the major news headline this morning, 8 Igboho's 8 freed from DSS custody. 8 Igboho's 8 freed from DSS custody. Again, court rejects AGF DSS plea to arrest Sunday Igboho, and that's on page 4 this morning of the Daily Independent newspaper. PDP stakeholders to move zone chairmanship position to the north, wants party to throw presidential tickets open. You can turn it to the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then on page 2 it says reorganization enabled marginal feed bid run 18 years after. That is coming from the DPR. You can get a copy of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving ahead, that's on page 39. Encourage more Boko Haram members to surrender. That is coming from Lawan. Says encourage more Boko Haram members to surrender. That's on page 39. You can get a copy of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. Moving ahead to page 5. Banks market closed in Enugu despite suspension of seats at home. You can get a copy of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then lastly, on the Daily Independent newspaper this morning, CBN names Bits INEC technical partner for digital currency projects. Pegs transfer limits as INERA takes off October 1st. You can get a copy of the Daily Independent newspaper to read more on that story. And that's all we have today on the Gallery TV newspaper review. You can get the Daily newspaper of the Nigerian newspaper this morning to read more on that story. You can get the Punch newspaper, Daily Sun newspaper, the Nation newspaper, the Guardian newspaper, and of course the Daily Independent newspaper to read more on all their stories this morning. And don't forget to join us again by 12 noon for yet another update. And of course, we have the 4 p.m. news also. You can join us for that. Thanks for watching and do have a lovely day. I remain Titilayo Olamide. Goodbye for now.